Hi there everyone, welcome back to Dandelion Delphi Tutorials. We're going to have a look at the OOP question of the final of 2020. That would be question 3. When you have a look at question 3.1, just before the questions start, you will find a table that describes the attributes of the class, and you'll have the names of the attributes on the left and then the description on the right, which is what is provided in your class. Now, first of all, you need to have a look at these and see what they're describing here. They say if a customer ID is a South African ID number, the size is a character, S, M, or L, that indicates the container size, if storage period, a number of months, and if paid is the amount that the customer have already paid. This you need to match up with the fields of your class. So go and have a look at your fields of your class. These data types here are very important, and sometimes that table does not make it clear as to what data type it is. So it's always important to have a look at your data types, as any parameter that you are going to receive through any method should match the data type to which it's going to give a value. Take note that you are not allowed to add any additional attributes or methods unless you are asked to do so in the question. This here is question 3.1.1. We always start with our class and then we move on to the main form. So I want you to create only one method at a time. First, start with your constructor and take note of the parameters it needs. The word receive indicates the number of parameters that this constructor needs to receive, and you do not want to create more or less. The word receive indicates its parameters, but here they've also included as parameter values, but in previous years they've excluded that, and the word receive was what helped us to know how many parameters we needed. You want to create exactly the number that is needed, no more or no less. Then they say assign these values to the respective attributes and set the if amount paid attribute to the value of 0. We're not receiving the amount paid here, we are only setting the attribute to 0, so there's no parameter for that. Press pause and try it yourself. So here I have created my constructor create with my 3 parameters. The ID number is a string. It's going to give if customer ID a value, so therefore I made it a string. P size, here I can see the container size is a char, so I'm going to make this parameter a char as well. And then finally the storage period in months, I just called mine P months. That is an integer and it's going to give if storage period a value. So after I've done this line here, I only do one line at a time. I'm going to push Ctrl-Shift-C and then I'm going to code my constructor create. Always remember your fields, if comes first. They go on the left. If you swap these around, you have a 40-mark question without any output. So make sure your fields go first and your parameters matching them go on the right. So for the container size and the storage period. And then finally they said we have to set if amount to 0. And that's what I've done in this last line here. Always tackle these questions from top to bottom. Don't try and jump around because sometimes one method will need another. Here is question 3.1.2 where we have to write an accessor method. An accessor method will always be a function, and as with a constructor it will always be public. Just create all your methods as public methods unless the question states otherwise. So accessor methods are functions. They are the easy marks to score. They give us the name to use, make use of that name, and this is for the attribute if amount paid. Press pause and try yourself. Accessor methods do not receive values. They do not have parameters, and if you read the question you'll see it's not receiving anything. So this here is my function get amount paid, and remember it's going to return if amount paid, which is real, and therefore this function must be real. So you want to match up the data type of the field with what it's returning, your attribute, what it's returning. Remember, functions always have a data type, and I've made it a public method. So then you're going to press Control-Shift-C. Remember, if it doesn't work, if Control-Shift-C doesn't work, it means you've made a mistake at the top here somewhere. You guys often forget that semicolons at the end of lines. Maybe there, or maybe you didn't have a data type for a function, and then Control-Shift-C doesn't work. So here is an accessor method. Very simply, result. Remember, every function needs a result. It's returning F amount paid, and that was it. The accessor method was worth 2 marks to 3 marks to score. The next one here, 3.1.3, asks us to write a method update amount paid. There's that word again that you're going to highlight, receive, and then you're going to take a pen, a value as a parameter. We have one parameter there and no other. So we only have one parameter, and we want to add it to the received value. We want to add the received value to F amount paid. Now this here is called a mutator method, since it's making a change to one of our fields of our class, also called attributes. That means it's a procedure. It will also be public. Press pause and try it yourself. So here is my procedure, update amount paid, with a parameter there. Now the reason I made this parameter real is because it's going to add on to F amount paid. F amount paid is real, and therefore I'm going to make this parameter real. Procedures don't have data types at the end, but that semicolon would be important for Control-Shift-C to work. And the P value that is received is going to be added onto F amount paid. So F amount paid is assigned to the amount paid plus P value, almost like a running total that we often do. Another 3 marks here, that's easy to score. The next question here says write code for a method. They don't say whether it is a function or procedure called calculate cost that will use the attributes to calculate, and this is another word you're going to highlight in your exam. You are going to highlight the word return or result, because that means it's a function. So we have to calculate this cost and return it. Then they say the monthly cost of a container will depend on the size. Remember, we have that field for the size. According to the size, this is the amount they have to pay. I would suggest you download these papers from education.gov.za. This is the 2020 paper, so that you can have this in front of you. But if you haven't done so, I suggest you take a screenshot, because they have not completed describing this method, and you'll need these values once you start coding. So on the next page here, the question continues. The monthly cost of the container is multiplied by the storage period per month. But now we get a discount of 10% of the total cost for every 6 months of the storage period. But there was a maximum of 50%, so they couldn't get more than 50% for their discount. And then they give you some examples there. If the storage period was 3, they get no discount. But if it was 6, they get 10%. And then if it was 25 months, they get 40%. This example is quite important because you can see 6 months would divide in there 4 times, so that's where the 40 comes from. So for the 1 extra month, they won't get a discount. So that is important to take into consideration when you are determining the cost here. And then here is an example of 72 months that goes over the 6 months period, or the 50%, the divide by 60, and then you can only get 50% discount. So that is why this is only 50%. Use the screenshot you made and this page here and try this function yourself. Since it had the word return in it, it's a function. It did not mention any parameters or any values that are being received. Since I'm going to use this F amount paid and there was a discount of percentage is always going to give you a real result. So that's why I used a real answer there. So first we just have to get the basic cost. Now I just use result as a variable. You don't have to declare a local variable and then later on assign it to result. If you do that, just make sure that result gets a value. The container size was what determined the basic cost, and that was a char data type, so ideal to use in a case statement. You could have used a nested if as well. If it was small, my result would be 1,000 Rand times by the storage period, and then for medium 1,750, and then for large. So now our result will have the value according to the size. Now we have to determine the discount. So I'm determining here how many 6 months I have, and I'm going to use div 6. So that would give me, for that 25 for example, 25 div 6 will give me 4. You could also have used if storage period divide by 6, but then you would have to use floor to round your answer down, or you could also use trunk. Now, should you want to use floor, you would have to add math there. I can't remember if this was added, but you are allowed to add math to the uses should you need it for one of the questions. Here I have maxed my discount at 40%, well at 50%. I could have said here is equal to 5 as well. Both of those are correct. Or I could have said if the month is less than 6, that would mean 5 less or equal to 5. Then I'm going to take the result, this top one here, and I'm going to deduct from that the percentage. So should this be 4 months, or well, 4 multiples of 6 for that they get a discount for, it would be 40%. When you're doing a percentage, always have your percentage here. So this will become the 40 divided by 100 using my result. So taking that original amount and calculating 40% of that and then deducting that from this amount that I've determined there. If this value was now more than 5, so anything from 6 onwards, I've maxed it here at 50%. So they can't get more than 50% discount. And I'll take the result minus 50% of the result. I'm sure you could have just said result divided by 2 as well. That would have given you the same answer. And the last question for the class here was to complete the Tostring. They gave you the declaration and just result is assigned to an empty string. And then they give you what it should look like. Now these brackets here you do not need to produce. They mean that what's inside of these two guys, that is fields from your class and sometimes even some of your methods. So there's an example of output as well. Press pause and try this yourself. It is important here to take note that there is a rand symbol and 2 decimal places. Make sure you've accommodated for that. So my first line has result and then a label, and then we have our fields, and then we have #10 at the end to create that enter. The next line then, from there onwards, we'll have result is assigned to result plus to build onto this initial string. Very important is to include these labels. There are marks allocated for these labels. If container size was a char data type, so compatible with the string data type of my result, and again my #10, then storage period, that was an integer, so we needed to interstring that. And then finally my amount paid, very important that you have used float string F with the amount paid, FF currency, and that you are displaying 2 decimal values. You've now reached the end of question 3.1, and this is the time that I suggest you save and run your program. Other teachers might differ from me, but I feel that if you had any syntax errors, you can sort them out now in your class before you move on to 3.2 with your main form. So this is what the main form looks like, and there is lots of input before we have to instantiate our object. Here we are asked to extract the customer's ID, the first letter of the container size, and then the storage period in months from a spin edit. and then only do we instantiate the object. Make sure that you get input for your parameters before you instantiate your object. Instantiating the objectives means that you have to call your constructor create. And then we have to disable this button. Don't forget to do that. Press pause and try it yourself. Now you need to keep in mind what the data types are of your parameters. So there I have a string for the ID. For input from a list box, it works the same as for a combo box and array group. We have .items, and then in square brackets we have the list box .item index. This produces a string, so in order to store just the first character as a char, I simply add square brackets 1 at the end. For the months, remember your spin edit has a .value property that is an integer, so then you don't need to typecast. It also has a text property, but then if you use .text, you're going to have to string to int. Now before we look at this code here, maybe you have seen this before, but this is what I recommend you do when you need to instantiate the object. They have given you the declaration of your object there. So what you want to do is you want to highlight it, Control-C, copy it, paste it down here, change that colon to an assignment statement, add to the back of this dot, create, and then when you open the bracket, it is going to give you the hints and the order of your parameters, and these are your arguments. Your arguments and your parameters need to match in node, number, order, and data type. So let's just have a look at my completed one here. That's how I created this. I use this method copying and pasting because you guys sometimes forget how to do it and then you leave little bits out. So that is just an idea of how to remember how to do your instantiating of the object. Very important line of code to study. Without this line of code, your program will produce no output. 40 mark question, but no output. So this is really crucial. Here are my parameters. The N stands for number. I have 1, 2, 3 parameters in my constructor create. So I have to send it 3 arguments. I quickly copied out the declaration of the constructor create from my class just so you guys can see. Here we had 3 parameters, so I need 3 arguments. Then the O is for order. It must be ID, size, months. And then D for data type. First one must be a string, second one a char, and then the third one an integer. And don't forget to enable that button. Remember we have an enabled button that we assign to true or false. Sorry, this was disabling it. So we're going to set the enabled property to false to disable a button. To enable it, we're going to set enabled to true. This next question is asking us to use the relevant method to calculate the amount due for hiring the container, the one that we wrote. And then we had to display the final amount due on the panel. Remember the panel has a .caption property, and take note of the label there as well. So here is an example of output. Maybe I'll make it a little bit smaller so that you guys can see more at a time. And then you can try it yourself. Press pause and try it yourself. I'll show you some more output to test your program with. You could have done this in more than one step. You could have created a local variable there to store this value of calculate cost, the method we created. Or you could just have placed that in a floater string f. And it's important to make use of your FF currency and showing 2 decimal values. This is just a reminder that once you've done your instantiating of the object, you are done with the type, the T transaction. From now on, you are only going to use the object. So here you have object.calculate cost. No method can stand on its own. You always have to precede it with the object dot before you call the method. Now you guys sometimes have test your program. So, well, you're going to test it. You have your input, you instantiate it, you test this button, that all works. But see what happens that you sometimes, what you do is, because you know this question works, You then click on this one here, and then you get an access violation. Now, the reason why you're getting that access violation is because this line of code has not run yet. You can't run any other method until your constructor ran. So until you've instantiated the object, none of these other methods can be used. So the only way to get around that issue is you always have to first click on Instantiate the Object. Now when I click there, I have no error. This next question tells you to extract the amount entered in the input box. Extract just means get input from the user. Use the appropriate methods to update the attribute of the amount paid with the amount extracted. Use the appropriate methods to calculate the updated amount due and display the updated amount due. And then they give you some examples there of output. So now you guys can press pause, try it yourself, and test your program. Here we are getting input from the user from the edit box. Always remember, if none of your code, let's say a program doesn't want to run at all, at least do the input and the output, because there are marks still allocated for that. Then we had to use the appropriate method to update the amount. This was a procedure. A procedure stands on its own, so it's not part of another assignment statement like here I'm using my functions. A procedure just stands on its own. You call it, you send it its parameters, matching them in NOD with the arguments with the parameters. This one had only one and it was real. Then we had to determine the amount that they're still owing. So I have to calculate the cost and deduct from that how much they have paid. Now, update amount paid makes a change to F amount paid, and the get amount paid is the accessor method for F amount paid. So this really is my F amount paid. So this is what I owe minus what I have paid so far. That I've stored there in a variable, and again we're displaying in a panel. .caption is assigned to floater string F and FF currency with 2 decimal places. And for this last question, question 3.2.3, I think it's going to take longer to read it than to code it. You have to write code to display the attributes of the transaction in the rich edit by using the Tostring method. And then there is the example. So press pause and try it yourself. They provided you with a rich edit.clear. All you had to do is have a rich edit.lines.add. Remember your object.Tostring. And that was it. The Tostring will always be called as part of another statement because it's a function, but then also to produce output. So like for example in a rich edit or maybe in a panel, show message, even writing to a text file. Maybe you just want to test your program against the second output. It is important to test for both because they would use different values and different months there. And that's just to double check that your calculations is working. So don't think when one example of output is working that you should not test the second one. Thank you guys for watching Dandelion Delphi tutorials. For more explanations and rules that you can study and more practice, you can have a look at Dandelion Delphi Book 3 where I also explain OOP. Remember to leave some comments and likes, and I hope to see you soon.